Well, hey folks, it's your old pal King Waspinator. Welcome back to Total Party Skills. For many years I've been putting off getting a hold of this, but I finally knuckled down and got the big box set of the Savage Worlds version of Rifts. Now, as far as box sets go, it's actually satisfyingly heavy, largely because it includes the 3 core rulebooks in it. Also has a nice, fairly generic but nice quality Game Master screen. And actually, my favorite thing that's in this whole damn thing is the extremely well put together map of North America they have, with various locations and emergent nations of the post-apocalypse properly sketched out instead of just being vaguely planted on a black and white map of the United States like you find in a lot of the original Palladium books. Overall, it's well polished. The artwork is wonderfully consistent, which is another thing you can kind of complain about, if that's really a complaint, about the older Palladium editions of these books. However, I would say that, it could either be a pro or a con depending on how you look at it, but it's a much more simplified presentation of the setting. Generally, I approve of the aspects of the Rifts world that they've decided to focus on. They kind of do what I myself like to do, which is kind of lean away from the classic fantasy tropes and more into the alien kind of stuff. But there's things about it that I kind of feel are kind of fan servicey. And its rule system, I have not run. I'm fairly new to the Savage World system. Reading their core rule book, it reminds me of a couple different games, and the overall vibe kind of reminds me of GURPS, and so in many ways, this version of Rifts is kind of like just a GURPS version of Rifts. Take that as you will. I got into the World of Darkness games back in the 90s because of the GURPS versions of Vampire the Masquerade and the GURPS version of Werewolf the Apocalypse before I finally, got into the actual White Wolf editions of those games. So as a gateway to get people into the original Rifts, sure. Also because it's a more simplified version of the setting, it still gives you some value to going out and getting the original world books, even if you're not going to use Palladium's rule system and character creation system. They're so chock full of lore, you'll still be able to mine all sorts of setting background details and adventure hooks and stuff that you can transplant into a Savage Rifts version of the game, if that's what you choose to run, while it might be a bit easier on players. The character creation system, it's easy. When I first looking at it, it looked like it was more complicated than it was, but my very first time, I was able to whip out a Rifts character in 10 minutes, which is compared to the fact that it can take up to 2 hours for some people to make Rifts characters using the original system. That seems like it might be great, especially if you're trying to do a session 0 with a bunch of people all making their characters at once. However, something is lost in that, and the thing that I always felt hesitant about switching over to the Savage Worlds version when I first heard they were going to do this years ago is that the rule system very much colors how the game feels. The Palladium characters feel very gritty and real because of the amount of time you have to spend deciding all their various skills and talents and all that kind of stuff. This is just write all this stuff down and play. There's a place for that, for sure. But, I don't know. Part of, to me, the attraction of Rifts is just how in-depth it all feels because of how well you understand the people that are being portrayed as player characters. And there's a world depth also to the original presentation that just can't be covered like this when they're just kind of skimming along, giving you the surface details without getting into the deep underpinnings of the motivations for all this stuff. And speaking of motivations, here's another thing that I find a little strange about the Savage Worlds version of Rifts. It's a system that does not feature a classic alignment system. So therefore you would think, because of that, you would have kind of a more morally ambiguous setting. Rifts, even though it doesn't use the D&D specific type alignments of lawful good, chaotic neutral, evil lawful, all that kind of stuff, it has something similar. It has alignments within the overall categories of good, evil, selfish, and yet I feel that the original Rifts has more moral ambiguity, not just in spite of the alignment system. The characters might be more wed to a specific moral code, but the world they live in expresses a broader variety of moral codes available to play. Because one thing that initially really stood out to me about the character creation section of their Tomorrow Legion's handbook, which is another thing I'll get into in a minute, is it just leans too much into all the good guy classes. I mean, it doesn't even include shifters in the basic book. You have to get their, Arcana and Mysticism supplement to get stats for playable shifters. It removes all the Coalition classes as something that's optional for players, at least if you're just going with the basic set stuff, and you don't use the Empire's Humanity book. And even then, it truncates a lot of the stuff out of it, and it more clearly frames the Coalition as the bad guys. The thing is that in old Rifts, it wasn't that the Coalition was framed as good guys. It was framed in such a way that you could play characters that are on a transformational journey, a, dare I say, anti-racist journey, where they starting off as characters of a paranoid, xenophobic, fascist society that through the course of their adventures are learning to, trust and become friends with literal aliens and people who practice magic. And eventually, hopefully, if you're telling the story, quote unquote, right, they will turn on their own government and, try to fight against the fascism that they were raised under, because they've come to an understanding. It's in ways kind of like if you're to run a Coalition type character through an adventure story like that in Rifts, it's very much like role-playing through Nazi deprogramming, which you'd think would be like a positive thing, especially in today's age. Unfortunately, I guess they're worried that if people might take it too literally and try to lean in on playing Coalition as villain, and actually just playing Coalition characters as xenophobic monsters. And I guess that's kind of on the Game Master for setting up their campaign to be like that in the get-go. And I don't know, just completely removing the option for it kind of changes things. I mean, part of the thing about role-playing for a long time is that, yes, evil is an option. It doesn't mean that you yourself are evil, but you are playing as. And also, people's definition of good and evil is somewhat subjective anyway, so what that even really means depends a lot on the people playing and the person running the game. Removing it entirely by not having alignment, but also removing the bad guy classes, it kind of, I guess, makes it a bit more of a Saturday morning cartoon kind of setting, as opposed to this gritty, weird gonzo sci-fi setting. I guess take that as you will. There's things added to it that I'm not so sure about. It's set in the year 109 of the calendar, so it's set after the Siege on Tolkien, except it seems to kind of be in a split timeline, whereas mainstream Palladium from 109 out leads into the Minion War, which to some, controversy kind of reframes the Coalition suddenly now as the good guys of Earth, because they're the ones who are best equipped and in the best position to fight off two invading demonic armies. Which, there's been some complaints about that from the community. And so that's kind of what feels fan servicey about this, because it ignores the Minion War and clearly puts the Coalition in a bad guy box. And then it introduces this new faction called the Tomorrow Legion, which was founded by Lord Coke as kind of like a next level step in him trying to create, some sort of order of peace and justice in this world, since the Cyber Knights had their falling apart during the Siege on Tolkien. And so it kind of moves the basic starting setting of the original Rifts, which is kind of around the Great Lakes, Minnesota, Wisconsin area, down to Arkansas, Missouri. And also, it's kind of setting things up so that there's going to be another war between the Federation of Magic and the Coalition, which, in context of what had already, been played out through the Siege on Tolkien series, even if it kind of slightly changes things by changing who the aggressor is, it's still basically just a repetition of what's already, gone through. The Minion War, despite whatever flaws you might have with the framing of things, at least was something different and a larger global scale kind of event that helps reset the setting. By setting it in 109 and leaving out the Minion War, you leave out the setting reset that the Minion War provides, and just still attach yourself to years and years of lore that the person running it, just like, you know, if people play 5th edition D&D and are trying to run things in Forgotten Realms, you inevitably are drawn to go to Drive-Thru RPG so you can get the old 2nd edition Forgotten Realms books, because they are actually full of all the information you need to really understand the world that Forgotten Realms is. Likewise, I can see people who only experience the Savage World books eventually being dragged off to Palladium.com so they can order some of these old world books to actually get the full story on the Juicer Uprising and the Siege on Tolkien and other things that this references but doesn't really explain very well. So I can't speak to the functionality of its rules. They describe themselves as being quick and easy to play, which, if true, might give it like some bonus leg up over the original Rifts setting system, because the Palladium game system is clunky. It's you know, someone's garage rules that they've been making games off of for 3 decades. They are well play tested, but occasionally they do have little issues crop up of trying to make sense out of exactly how you're supposed to rule certain things. And the fact that like SDC and MDC both cause complications. And so they still seem to maintain MDC in a way in Savage Worlds. I was kind of hoping they would just do without that. I don't see why you just can't have your energy weapons and certain armor just have really large point pools instead of creating this tiered damage system that seems to confuse some players, especially newer ones. And I don't know. I mean, it's I'm not sure if there's enough gained in terms of, yes, the production is nice, the art quality is nice, the streamlined presentation is helpful if you want your players to have a chance to better understand this without handing them like reams upon reams of material to have to read to familiarize themselves with this. But yet this world itself is still complicated, so if you as the game master are still, you know, being the font for which your players learn of everything in the setting, it's still an awful lot of information to have to throw at them and for them to have to then keep track in their heads to understand what the hell they're interacting with. One advantage games like Star Wars and Dungeons & Dragons has is that they exist in worlds that are full of familiar pop culture tropes, so that casual players who don't have time to delve into all this lore, or don't even have the interest to delve into all this lore, can still understand what they're interacting with, because your average person knows what a Wookiee looks like and knows what an elf is. Whereas you take your average person and plop them into Rifts and then tell them that they're facing a minion of Splugorth, that could mean anything, you know. So I don't know. It's a toss-up. I'm not. I personally, I'm so attached to Rifts from having like run it throughout the years and followed the storyline throughout the years since I was a teenager. It's really hard to have an unbiased read to say for sure if Savage Worlds is better or not. It has its pros and its cons. I feel that the two things could supplement each other well. If you're looking for an easier game system that's not going to necessarily intimidate people who are new to the setting, and you want to actually try to have a session 0 that doesn't last 20 hours as you're trying to get 5 people to make characters all at once. And the box set, considering what they sell the individual books for brand new, the box set's not that bad of a deal. Beyond the map and the Game Master screen and the 3 core books, it also gives you some dice, like all box sets have dice, and bennies, which are like poker chips that Savage World seems to use in a manner similar to like Modiphius's threat points, or having an inspiration point in 5th edition D&D works, at least from what I've read. The thing that I feel like it's missing is, for some fucking reason, it doesn't have a deck of cards in it. And playing cards are also apparently essential to this rule system. You can kind of see that the presence of Deadlands in the Savage Worlds repertoire of settings has had some kind of thematic effect on how their rules are presented. Because there's a lot of poker isms in it. which, if you want to have your gamers sit around a nice poker table and have all the accoutrements of a poker game, Rifts isn't a bad setting for that because it does draw a lot of Western type tropes and imagery into it. But I don't know, is it really better or worth it to use Savage Rifts over the OG version? I guess that's up to you. If I were to rank all the various different version of Rifts, I would probably put Savage Worlds right in the middle at number 3. At the bottom of it, on number 5, I would put Rifts Ultimate Edition as a starting game rule book. The part of the thing about how the original Rifts is set up is it has a Game Master section and just enough stuff in there to create random monsters and villains and a few other things so that you can run a Rifts game with only this book and nothing else. It certainly helps to have all the source books they've put out because they greatly flesh out the world and the type of stuff you can find in it, but you can still at least run a couple adventures just using material in this book. With Rifts Ultimate Edition, they spend a lot of time kind of trying to fix things and problems that they created over the years of their World Book series, and doing a lot of things to try to enhance the power levels of the original core character classes so they can make them comparative to the, not comparative, so they can make them competitive with the power creep that you see in the classes that came out over the years in the various supplements, which got more and more powerful, especially during the period of time when C.J. Corello was writing game books for Rifts. And I don't know, and because of that, it ends up not having any space for anything about monsters or random creatures or supernatural horrors or any of that kind of stuff. Basically, if all you had was a copy of Rifts Ultimate Edition, your players can fight other NPCs of the same classes as them and fight your basic set of coalition bad guys, and that's it. You're forced to have to get some sort of source book or another to be able to have anything else for your player characters to go up against. And I consider that a flaw. At number 4, I would put After the Bomb. After the Bomb is not technically Rifts. After the Bomb started off as an adventure series for their Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and other strange role-playing game that after Palladium lost the licensing for Ninja Turtles, they kind of kept their game line alive just by rebranding the entire thing as After the Bomb, where you play mutant animals in a post-nuclear apocalyptic setting. But the thing is there's an awful lot of themes and concepts in After the Bomb that ended up being in Rifts. So I view After the Bomb as a bit of a fun kid's prototype for what Rifts would become. So I would include it on the list. And like I said, number 3, I'd put Savage Worlds Rifts. It's kind of right in the middle. It's got its advantages, but it's also a little, I don't know, not bad. I do not want this to be construed as me being terribly negative on Savage Worlds. I just find it kind of middling. A resounding, that's okay. Which isn't the best thing in the world, but I'm hardly saying it's shit. At number 2, I would rank OG Rifts with all of its flaws. It's still an incredibly rich, in-depth setting with a lot of cool ideas to be mined and a lot of different ways you can present it. You can run it as a survivalistic post-apocalyptic wilderness game. You can have it as a big mech war game, science fiction, cyberpunk, Cthulhian horror, classic high fantasy, classic low fantasy. It's all possible at the same time with the original Rifts. But oddly, I would say the best version of Rifts of all, the number 1, is Rifts Chaos Earth. Now, Rifts Chaos Earth is kind of like an offshoot of Rifts, set at the very beginning of the apocalypse, just like in the very first few months after the cataclysm begins. And ironically, though, that leaves it much more open-ended. There's very little in the way of the world specifically described. It kind of just relies on the fact that it's real close to the world we live in right now, so we don't necessarily need a rule book on Colorado kind of a thing. So that it leaves the GMs writing adventures and campaigns in Chaos Earth to have a tremendous amount of free space. They can still incorporate things from all the various Rift supplements. and new creative ways that will keep experienced Rift players on their toes. There is a bit of a problem with Rifts, is that it's old and that the fan base of players are often just as well read, if not more so, than some of the people trying to run the game. And Rift's Chaos Earth is so detached from the lore of the original series that helps negate that. You can still use a lot of the classic stuff, but in ways that will surprise and confound these experienced, jaded players. I also find that Rift's Chaos Earth presents a much more tightly focused set of player characters to choose from that is easier to justify all these people being together and working together and doing what they're doing. So anyway, I guess I can scratch this off my list now. I've reviewed Rift's Savage Worlds. If you're a Rifts fan, I would say it's worth checking out. If you're a Savage Worlds fan and haven't tried Rifts, I would very highly recommend you check it out, because if you're already used to using this world system, then for you, this is a great introduction to one of the great sci-fi role-playing games, you know, of the 90s at least, if not still standing amongst the high ones today. It's not like there's a lot of really good, high-quality, original science fiction that's not some IP of one type or another. So yeah, I guess that's it. Be sure to like and subscribe. You can find me on Twitter at PartySkills. Tell me below in the comments like how wrong I am about everything I just said, and all that good stuff. You have a good one, and stay waspinated.